Welcome back, everyone. I want to introduce you to Laird Barron. Laird is a predominantly horror writer, but he also writes crime fiction, or actually, you could argue he's predominantly a crime writer, given the number of books he's written. So he's written some crime fiction, horror, also some science fiction and fantasy. Laird, why don't you just tell the audience, the 1,000-foot level background of who you are, where you're from, and the sorts of things you write.
Hey, Sean, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to see you again. So, Laird Barron here. I've been writing professionally for about 22 years. I'm predominantly known as a horror writer, but I think that you might have hit on something. I think it might be accurate to say I'm a noir crime writer who inflects it with horror. And my last three novels were actually set in kind of a noir mystery thriller sort of genres, the Isaiah Coleridge trilogy. But prior to that, I was pretty well known for writing a lot of short horror fiction and three kind of cosmic horror, Lovecraftian style collections: the Imago sequence, Occultation, and The Beautiful Thing That Awaits Us All. But I definitely veer toward kind of hard-boiled characters who run into things that put them completely out of their depth, despite their wealth of experience, their toughness, their training, as opposed to sort of the traditional horror aesthetic, especially in Lovecraftian horror, of the effete nobility running into something, or academics, or a lot of modern Judeo-Christian horror. It's kind of the everyman, every person kind of a narrator that gets in over their heads. I've always kind of veered toward the hard bark character, and I think that has a lot to do with being born and raised in Alaska, living there for the first 25 years of my life. My dad was a Marine. My grandfather was in World War II, served on a destroyer. That kind of a thing. And then for many years, my family lived in the wilderness on a homestead. There was a land act back in the late 70s, and you could grab a parcel of land up to 10 or 20 acres. And so we had 10 acres, and we were really roughing it. And I think that had a lot to do with my development and inclination as a writer, not to mention that we didn't have a lot in the way of entertainment all those years. Kerosene lamps. We had a little gas generator that we could run, an hour a day to power a car battery, which in turn allowed us to have a little tiny 7 or 8 inch black and white TV so we could watch the news. But the rest of the time, you were on your own for entertainment. So it was the book collection my mom had. She had a bunch of Westerns and romance novels, and of course, science fiction and crime. And I just powered through that during my adolescence.
Didn't you? I'm going to throw in a random thing that I may have picked up from the ether. So correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't they find your grandfather kind of out in the wilderness, and there's he may have been attacked or something about a grizzly bear? I don't want to put words into the
right
story, but
it's all sort of, I received it secondhand because I wasn't particularly close to my grandfather by that point, but and it happened, I want to say, near Carmax. It's in the Canadian wilderness. Mm-hmm. And he had a gold claim up there, and when he died, he was in his 60s. So they found his remains near his gold claim, and there was a 4-wheeler that he'd been using, and it was stuck in the mud nearby, because this occurred essentially in Canadian spring. This happened like in either early June or late May, which would be mud season where he was. Mm-hmm. And so they don't know whether he died of a heart attack and then the bears came upon him and ate him, or whether he was trying to get away from them and they ate him. But he was eaten. There is no dispute about that. A couple grizzlies, there was just nothing left of him. So that's how he met his demise. And that was back in 92.
Wow. Have you had any encounters growing up with grizzlies, or large game, anything like that? Well, I guess it's not game, so to speak.
Well, no, but I've seen grizzlies from afar. We've had encounters with black bear, which are of course the most prevalent.
Right.
North American bear, and even in the continent of Alaska, or the United State of Alaska, as the locals like to call it. But I've never had any experiences, any negative experiences up close with the big bear, including polar bear. But black bear, we've had some pretty close encounters with them. Had a lot of close encounters with, relatively speaking, with moose. I mean, all of them. I mean, they're prevalent there, and the fact that we lived in the wilderness, I've traveled at least 40 to 50,000 miles on the back of a dog team over, the 12 or 14 years that I munched
You
dogs.
already anticipated my next question, my friend.
Well, the point I'm just
Yeah.
going to make it, it's kind of like when we cite, oh, this breed of dog bites people. You're like, okay, but there's millions of these pets out there, and so we get X amount of bites. It sounds like a lot, but when you start, so I've been stomped by moose. Everybody in my family has, but compared to how many times they could have stomped us, it was pretty negligible. But I want to say, just like all the guys in my family, at least my immediate family, have had close encounters and have been run over by moose. But moose are, I think, on a day-to-day basis or percentage basis, are far more of a threat to your health than a black bear.
And is that because during the period when they're in heat, they're more aggressive, or is it just in general?
Just in general, it depends on where you meet them too. But obviously, I think a lot of people that get hurt by a moose are in small towns or suburbs, and so it's like any other wild human encounter. If it happens in a place where people travel or live, a lot of times the incidents are more extreme. They escalate because people aren't afraid of them, or the animal's not as afraid of the people, and so there's this more likely to be a close quarters interaction. In our case, the reason that we had trouble with them was completely different. It's wintertime. In the summertime, they would run away from us almost every time. You just make noise and they're gone. But in the wintertime, with 14, 18 feet of snow, and then you're traveling on the snowmobile trail, that's the only real trail. Moose don't want to get out of that trail. They do not want to go floundering through the snow any more than you do. And so a lot of times you'll come around the corner on your snowmobile or on your dog team or hiking or whatever, and there's really nowhere where to go. And so the moose, if they attack, that's a lot of times what will, that and, babies, obviously calves or something. But those are the primary times when we've had encounters, was due to just, there wasn't really any practical way for me to get out of the way, or I was on my dog team. And of course they look at dogs and they go, a dog team, they go wolves. And I've seen what happens to them when the wolves get a hold of them. So they're very much, terrified of wolves. And so it's either fight or flight. And a lot of times they'll fight. So you just have to be really, it's one of the, if you travel a lot in the wilderness in Alaska in the wintertime, that's one of the hazards you face is moose.
Now, you mentioned having a dog team. You participated in the Iditarod a few times. Mm-hmm. How did you get involved in that, and how has that experience informed some of your writing?
Well, that's an interesting question. It informed my writing right from the start, but I didn't really talk about Alaska much until about 6 years ago. I wrote a collection, the fourth collection. It was called Swift to Chase, and almost every story was set in Alaska. And the Iditarod came up. But it took me a long time. It took me many years being away from Alaska before I felt like I had enough emotional distance to tackle it, at least consistently. But the way I got into the Iditarod, what happened is I was born up in Alaska, but my father comes from Texas, my mom from Oregon. And their families had gone back and forth from Alaska back in the 50s. And Alaska was just, it was still pretty wild back in the 50s. Even the settled area, the white settled areas were still pretty wild. And there were very few paved roads until the 70s. So, and even then, half of Anchorage, which is the biggest city up there, was unpaved. My father actually helped a paving company pave a lot of the businesses in Anchorage in the mid to latter 70s. But so they traveled back and forth, established homesteads, both sets of parents established homesteads. And then they finally settled for good in the early 60s. And then my dad went off to Vietnam when he was, or joined the Marines when he was 17, went off to Vietnam, and this would be the very late 60s. And then, of course, I came along. And when I was very young, I was about 8 years old, my father just, to this day, I'm not sure because we're sort of estranged, but so I never really found out the story. But he just had enough of basically the rat race, as he called it. And he packed us up and put us on a river boat, and we went up the Yentna River about 60 miles. And the Land Act, he settled on a piece of land that was kind of set back from the river on a hill and built a cabin, Swiss Family Robinson style. It was very primitive, very rough. We didn't have any money. I've always said that living in the wilderness, either you live in a land of milk and honey where resources are flowing freely, or you have a lot of money. Otherwise, you're miserable. And we were very miserable for at least the first 5 or 6 years. It was a tough experience, but it certainly influenced everything I've ever written. Pardon me. It warmed up the last couple of days, and my allergies are going crazy. But yeah, it always influenced my writing, but it wasn't necessarily something that I approached directly until the last few years, and now I do write about it more directly.
Would you say Alaska shows up as a character, or that's a simplistic way of putting it, but that experience shows up in your writing in a way that conveys kind of the harsh environment, like an environment that's out to kill you, things like that?
Yeah, I've used the word romanticize, but I mean that kind of in a more neutral way. In other words, I do like to imbue or characterize landscapes, whether it's Alaska or New York State, where I live now. I lived in Montana for a short period. Any of these rugged sort of wilderness, because New York State has a lot of wilderness. That was one thing that I really learned, is it's primarily wilderness with huge population centers. But and even the population centers here, a lot of them, unless you're in New York City, there's wilderness out our back door here. Catskills are right behind us, and yet if I go north of here 10 minutes, I'm in a city of 40,000. But and this comes from my experience in Alaska, and I felt it elsewhere, and I've talked to people who've grown up in the Midwest, or people who've grown up overseas in some remote location, like in the mountains or something. So I don't think it's particular to me or to Alaska, but Alaska, especially as I got older and more reflective, and I actually raced the Iditarod in my 20s and was able to kind of cut across some of the more remote sections of Alaska, kind of in the way that I think the sailors used to know the sea much better back before before engines, back when they were just sort of gliding with sails. You would see wildlife, and you would just experience it in a much more visceral way than we do now, with windscreens and engines blasting and heaters and whatnot, in cars, in all-terrain vehicles and planes, in yachts. And I had the privilege to experience deep, ancient Alaska, remote Alaska, with just me, the dogs, essentially on a pair of skis with a toboggan. And I did that 3 times. And of course I went, I fished, commercial fishing. So I've not a hugely extensive traveler. Like, I didn't spend my life traveling across Alaska, but I've devoted many, many thousands of miles and many hundreds of hours out there, and enough to really, it engendered in me this feeling of an antibody kind of reaction to us, that nature seems to have. Like, it may not be sentient, although I wouldn't even rule that out. But there's
it has
like
a consciousness.
Yeah, same way as your body does, separate from your brain, right? Your body doesn't understand that it's been infected with the germ. It just out come the antibodies. And I really do feel sometimes when I'm in remote places, Montana, I got the same feeling occasionally, is that there's always this pressure around us to expel us. And I think I think that it's part and parcel with how it's the whole circle, how animals eat each other, how there's always this sort of struggle, not even just for primacy, but just for survival. So I don't think it's anything personal. And I don't think it means that human beings don't belong. I always actually kind of bridled at the idea that there's natural and then there's man-made. I'm like, well, what are we but part of nature? We're just maybe
Right.
a dysfunctional aspect of nature, but the bottom, or we might be an evolutionary dead end. But the bottom line is, I just felt on many occasions that my dogs and I were minute specks, and that we were being expelled, that there was this pressure to get us out of the body, like a splinter coming out of the finger, kind of thing. And it's purely anecdotal. I have no,
It's just a feeling, right? It's how you felt when you were out there. It's hard to explain.
Right. And but the relevance here is just to your question. I try to characterize landscapes, but in a naturalistic way. In other words, the way that I actually feel about it. Not so much that there's a mother earth watching over me or a Gaia or whatever, but just that it's a living, we're all part of a living organism, and it reacts to us.
Kind of like that Cormac McCarthy in Blood Meridian, like the way he talks about the landscapes and things like that. At least it reminds me of that. I don't know if it's accurate, but
no, that's a good. I was developing my own thesis about this. Obviously, I didn't start reading McCarthy until the late 90s, or somewhere in there. But yeah, it was one of those deals where when I read Blood Meridian, which took me about 6 weeks the first time, despite being a voracious reader, because I could only tolerate it in chapters essentially, or chunks, and I had to like recover and then read it some more, because it really hit me in a visceral way. Even though I've never had those, I cannot share kinship with riding into old Mexico and on a scalping expedition type of thing. I don't. That's not part of my family history. But the reaction of nature, of wilderness, to the incursion of humans and animals, domesticated animals, and how McCarthy characterized the almost interchangeability of the cosmos with the landscape, the alien landscape around them, and the minuteness of soft flesh. I completely, I found a kindred spirit when I ran into him. Somebody who understood precisely what I was thinking.
There is kind of a biblical aspect to it as well, at least the way he describes things and stuff like that. That is kind of in superposition with, but separate from, that other worldly aspect. And I can never pronounce it. Is it genius loci or is it genus loci? I cannot.
Well, that was what I was going to say, and that's how I pronounce it. I just pronounce it genius loci. It came up that phrase and my preoccupation. I have a few preoccupations that are threads that go through almost every one of my stories, even no matter what genre it is. There's very frequently that element, the element of, if there's anything to do with the wilderness, or even urban settings that have their own ecosystem and their own sort of subterranean, semi-sapient, semi-sentient sort of awareness. That's not
particularly
really awareness.
Particularly places where, I think one like walking through the Tenderloin in San Francisco, Yes. It's a dark place, and it's a dark place without people as well. It's almost like it's stained in some way.
Well, I'm sure we'll get into this later, and I'm no scientist, so this is just simply a fairly well-read person's anecdotal observations about things. But I don't make a huge separation between the wilderness and the urban wilderness, in the sense that they are different, but I still feel like the rules apply to both. That there's almost like this. There can be a genius loci element. There can be this sort of unconscious rhythm or ecosystem that is separate, that derives from, but is separate from the mass teeming humanity. Because I've lived in cities, and cities have their inexplicable and inhuman elements that actually, I think, transfigure the people that live there. I think that a lot of behaviors that we attribute to nurture are actually, they are nurture, but nature nurtures them. And I think you're going to see certain elements come to the fore in people, this transfiguring effect, in any kind of location, whether it's you're living in a ghetto or you're living in a high rise, setting, or whether you're living like I was for many years in a little cabin in the middle of nowhere. I think the outcomes are different, but I think that if you drew a line, there'd be a line between these, that they're not so different where they derive from. And they derive from, you are shaped psychologically, if not physically, by your environment.
So if kind of the genus loci aspect is one of the themes of your writing, what other themes do you find yourself coming back to over and over again?
There's several. I've used the word privilege again. I'm privileged to have been doing this. I've been writing since I was 5. Somebody said, how long did it take you to write your first book? And I said, about 35 years. Right. It was 37 years. It came out in 2007. That was my first book. But I've been writing professionally at this point for about 22 years. And the privileged aspect is that I have enough people that are interested in my work to justify editors buying it. And that has allowed me to branch out a little bit. When I first started professionally writing, it was primarily Lovecraftian, so to speak, cosmic horror. And, with a real bedrock of crime. I grew up reading Parker and Elmore Leonard and people like that, Louis L'Amour. And so there was like a real hard-boiled element, but horror, infusing that. These days, I write crime novels. I'm writing, actually right now, I'm working on weird fantasy mixed with science fiction, a la Gene Wolfe and Jack Vance's Dying Earth and some of his pure science fiction stuff, mixed with Robert E. Howard sword and sorcery. And it's quite different from anything I've done. You'll recognize some of the hard-boiled elements in some of the stories, and some of the stories don't have that at all. But it has allowed me to experiment. I'm not stuck just writing one thing. But conversely, it also allows me to, there's this ramifying element. I can continually go back and keep interrogating. Like one of my favorite, one of my obsessions is the tough guy and the femme fatale in crime fiction or noir. And there are so many, it's a niche, right? It's one thing, all right, how many ways can you write, or what is there to say about a gunfighter or a Yakuza, gang, enforcer, or a mafia enforcer, right? Or a drug runner or a Pinkerton agent. And see, I'm answering the question right there. It's endless there, because each one of these is slightly different than the other. But it being kind of a student of this aspect of the genre, I look at, like, say, how Japanese, noir unfolds, and there are some compelling similarities between, let's say, American or Western gangster cinema and gangster fiction. But there's also these dramatic and amazing deviations from one another. Like I've been watching quite a bit of, over the last 20 years, I've watched a hell of a lot of Yakuza and samurai flicks. Lone Wolf and Cub, one of the latest ones that I watch. And they'll do things, tough guys do things differently, or excuse me, writers do treat tough guys differently in Asian art forms than Americans do. And there are so many different elements. And so I wrote a few years ago, I did write a story. I tackled a story about a Yakuza, and he shows his emotions in ways that I don't have, or somebody like Parker, Elmore Leonard would never have a Western character do. And so I feel like, kind of like when we talk about some other subject, we say, love, romance, it's never out of style. There are conventions, there are cliches, there are formula, but we'll never be tired. We'll never completely excavate them or interrogate them to the point where, okay, everything's been said. Even something like the zombie or vampire, monsters, in literature and cinema. Okay, oh my God, it's another zombie story. And it's true.
Not to interrupt you. That's how I first became familiar with your work. I think it was in a canyon. I'm going to get it was like a vampire story, and it was more different. It was so different than anything I'd ever read before. Even with the imagery of like how the thing moved, there was like this phased movement to it where it was on top of you before you knew it was there. It was fascinating how you wrote that.
Like an insect. And not to ramble, I get kind of excited about this because you actually, when we were, people will see this next month, but when we were on the Bain forum or podcast, panel talking about your Weird World War IV anthology, one of the things that and we didn't really get to talk about that too much, but maybe we should, is the idea that writing to theme is not a straitjacket. And something I would almost bet that if you talked to John Langan recently, that might have come up, because he and I have talked about that form. Like as a college professor, he'll give out, right? He'll say, all right, you need to write a poem, and it has to be, a quatrain or something like that. And that people will initially, if you tell them it's got to be in a sonnet, it's got to be in a certain format and stick within that. A lot of people are reflexively like, oh, I it's all been done. And how do I, but the reality of it is, if you're a skilled writer, which is just a matter of practice in general, you realize that that's not a straitjacket, that it's actually this is the term I prefer, is a writing prompt. It is. Yeah. And the way that I approach that kind of stuff is to react against it. In other words, all right, I'll follow your rules for your anthology, or for your, if you want me to write a sonnet or something, but I'm going to fuck with that convention as much as I can and still be within the rules. And it becomes this game, which of course it fuels my creativity. And I think it's a real positive way to look at it. But so I love themed working for toward a theme. Somebody tosses me, says, hey, we're going to do a thing with vampires or vampirism. What can you do? Well, so it goes back to what we were just talking about a moment ago, is that my obsessions with nature and mankind's adversarial sort of relationship with the natural world, and kind of the types of people who actually have been at the forefront historically of pacifying nature, or doing battle with it, so to speak, are a certain type of person. But yet, even within those two obsessions, there's almost, I could write the rest of my life and probably not fully ask all the questions I want to ask.
Well, just to point to kind of highlight your point, in the interview that I did with John Langan, which will appear a few days before this one, we were talking about his story in Weird World War III, and he apologized. He says, I thought I was supposed to write a story, like a Lovecraftian type story. And I'm like, you were. That was the point of the anthology. However, the other authors did something a little bit different, right? For the creativity forced them to come with things that were just narrowly within range, but weren't quite a Lovecraftian story. And he rendered a brilliant Lovecraftian story. It was I thought it was one of the best, at least I thought it was one of the best ones in the anthology, but not everybody else did. And that's a good thing, because if they had, it wouldn't have been as interesting a range as it turned out to be, because everybody did something a little bit different. So
he's one of the best. Oh no, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, I was finished. I just didn't do it very elegantly.
No, all I was going to say is, we're, full disclosure, we're very close friends, but part of the reason, and I've said this 100 times, I'll probably say it 100 more. Part of the reason that we became friends and that we remain friends is because I have such great respect for his work and his aesthetic. So he really is one of the, I can objectively say that, that he's one of the great horror writers operating and weird fiction writers. And he routinely has, among one of the best stories in any anthology that I've seen. So, and it is kind of funny because, we strategize a lot, although we don't, that might be a strong way to put it, but we both share ideas for stories. I don't think either one of us actually shares manuscripts with anybody, but I certainly get on the phone with him, or if I'm visiting him, take the dogs out for a walk, or we have a glass of scotch after we watch. Because prior to COVID, I frequently would go over and we would watch, the weekly samurai flick or Yakuza flick or Western or whatever. And then we would talk about it afterward. But, we talk about, because we're in a lot of the same anthologies. And sometimes we even, if we know we're both going to be in one or we're trying to be in one, we'll add elements of each other's stories. Matter of fact, the one that you mentioned in a cavern in a canyon.
Yeah.
That's, I forget what his story is called in there. I remember what it's about. And his is more directly a vampire story, but we both have Orlando. The name Orlando is used. They're just different. In mine, it's a dog, and his is a person. But we both talk about Orlando. The monster that's in my story briefly is alluded to in his story, but it's all done in such a way that if you're not looking for it, you might not ever even, you could read that anthology 3 times and maybe not pick it up. But
did you do that in my anthology?
No.
Okay.
Not that I know of, but I haven't read everybody's story. I haven't read his story. I know it's a play. He sometimes does stuff. We sometimes do stuff and don't tell each other. So it wouldn't shock me if he, not necessarily about, because I did tell him I was writing about Rex. So I don't know if he mentioned Rex in there or a canine, but you never know. But we don't do it very often. See, that's the thing, is the whole trick is you just do it every now and then. But it goes back to your kind of the rules, your guidelines. We've talked about this, like, oh, we're both going to try to be in this one anthology. I mean, you never assume you're going to be in it. But we're both aiming to be in there. And so, what are you working on? What are you working on? And we have collaborated with, well, I know these other 10 guys, what they write. I'm probably going to do something, off in this other direction type of thing. And it's like predicting weather. I mean, you can't long range forecast. You don't really know what somebody's going to do, but I'm sure somebody could look at, like, if they, if somebody like, say, Paul Tremblay could look at my writing and go, oh, he's going to maybe be in this anthology. Well, probably some hard ass in his story. So I think I'm not going to have any hard asses in my story. That would be a safe bet.
Right.
And then I would, of course, fool him and have someone who has absolutely no inclination to ever defend themselves, a pacifist. But
so we talked about themes. There's a little bit of the the kind of hard ass, and there's also kind of the genus loci aspect. Mm-hmm. Anything else that kind of often appears in what you write?
Well, a couple things. One, I'm a believer or an adherent of the ecstasy of influence. So, I'll if someone credits me with an influence that I don't think exists, I might say, hey, I don't deserve that credit. I haven't read enough of, Hermann Hesse to really take that credit. But a lot of writers, or at least who have admitted it, really, I don't want to read other people's stuff because I don't want to, be like somebody else. Or I'm the opposite. I love it when somebody says, that reminds me of Cormac McCarthy. I'm like, well, it should. I've read a lot of Cormac McCarthy. The only time it's ever bad is if, like, well, this is like word for word somebody, and nobody, no authors are doing that. That's right. But you're not going to avoid, though, imagery, themes, even, I mean, we're working with the same 26 letters and we're working within overlapping genres. There's just going to be a lot of overlap. And so what I've always, I shouldn't say always, but what, at least for the last 15 years of my writing career, I've looked at like combat arts. If you're not strong enough to throw the guy, you let him throw himself. I'm not strong enough to buck influence. Matter of fact, I mean, I don't think anybody is. There's very few writers, if any, that I think are wholly original. What they did with what influenced them is what's wholly original. And so that's the strategy that I write with, that I for publication, is that, of course it sounds like McCarthy, of course it sounds like a John Carpenter movie, because these are all the things that are in the stew of my subconscious. So I roll with it and then try to add to it, to try to do my take on it, so that it pays homage to what influences me, but also justifies its existence by doing something different. So you can say, oh, Laird Barron's Coleridge character, that hard case detective of his, sure reminds me of, like, could be Jack Reacher or Travis McGee. Those are huge guys. Spencer's a pretty huge guy. They're all laconic. They're all kind of smart mouth. But he does this other thing with it. The guy is mixed race, and he's there's like this mythological Beowulf kind of supernatural or occult thing going in the background. And so you add your spin to it. And I don't know if I really have much else to say besides that, just that, you know, I'm a believer of the ecstasy of influence. And so, but what was the original? I've lost track of the original thing that you asked. You had a specific.
Just other themes that
right. Oh, so what I was going to say is, I guess that sort of answers it in a way. But what I was kind of getting at is, you don't always know what your obsessions are until you've written enough to look back and go, as I did, wow, I guess Poe really influenced me far more, even though I read him out the ass when I was a kid. Yep. So much insanity in my stories, so much drug use, so much drunkenness, and so many living the idea of living burial keeps coming back, which I have a fear of in my own life, or a sort of a phobia. And so there's that, but there's also animals play a huge, specifically dogs and horses play a huge role in my fiction, and more so over the last 7-8 years. Dogs frequently appear, and I feel very strongly about our relationship to dogs in general.
Right.
I feel like we have a pact with them that obviously goes back thousands of years.
I don't know where I read this. I don't know if you wrote this either, but it may have been something you wrote, but I can't remember. I just like it's like a bond that started from kind of wolves outside the campfire. Yeah. And slowly one was kind of, the pact was made, right? Where the first humans and shared food with the dog, and then I don't know if I read that from you, or if that's just something that's just like a generic general memory, right?
It's hard to say. I've written about it, but I've also read about it, so I can't say. I'm certainly not the first person to make the observation. I got to give brief credit to kind of my more formal thoughts on it over the last few years to Linda Shea, Michael Shea's wife. I was visiting them there in Napa wine country. They had a place, or they do have a place over there. And we were walking through the hills, and we were just talking, and they were like, our dog Moose used to go through the field over there, and he was so big, and our kids were so little that they could literally hang off his belly because he had thick fur, and like hang on him while he was walking through the bushes. Kind of like the image of the Greeks hiding in the sheep when they're in Polyphemus's cave. And so we're talking about that, but what she said this thing that has never left me. She said, well, dogs are sort of like having ESP in a way. And I'm just paraphrasing her, but she said, basically they were radar before we had radar. They were infrared security foot camera before we had it, because she goes, the dog senses are so dramatically, and of course they were wolf-like back in the day, right? Mm-hmm. So they are so dramatically escalated beyond our own 5 senses that when a dog pricks up his or her ears, it doesn't mean that something's right outside of your field of view. There could be something quarter mile away that they're picking up on. And so she talked about how they helped us, if you think about it, how they really helped us pacify our regions, our habitat, because they allowed us to know what was going on around us. And I never forgot that. That basically, and that's all she really said about it. But of course, I started brooding on that over the next few years, and researching it, and examining my relationship with my dog at the time, and of course thinking back to when I had sled dogs. Yeah, if you think about it, this is an ancient pact, and one of my characters says in the story, it's a debt, it's a blood debt, and it's not one that we'll ever repay. We simply pay off the interest.
On that note, I'm going to end this episode. In the next episode, I want to talk about your mythos in as much detail as we can get into it. Thank you, Laird.